Good morning. During lockdown, we worked our way through the book of Philippians. And this month, in the month of October, we are looking at chapter 4 in more detail. Last week, Carl looked at the subject of anxiety and prayer. This week, we're looking at contentment. And next year, we're going to conclude this mini-series by looking at generosity. We live in a world that bombards us to want more, to think better, to want the next new thing, that this will lead to contentment. And I'm not saying that these things in and of themselves are wrong, but we need to examine what it creates within ourselves. Does it generate anxiety, greed, and a lack of contentment as we strive to obtain them? For many, the last 7 months have been the ultimate test of this, particularly with regards to contentment. And certainly as I've been looking at social media and things, you can see people's discontentment growing as the situation seems to have gone on and on with no end in sight. Perhaps for some, the secure job you had that you thought was a job for a lifetime has disappeared overnight. That dream holiday that you'd been saving for many years has cancelled. You've postponed your wedding, or maybe you whittled your guest list down to 30, only to a few days before to be told you could only have 15. Maybe you've now not seen parents, children or grandchildren for 7+ months. And this is leading to, in our hearts, a greater and greater sense of discontentment. But as Christians, we don't need to live in this discontentment. If we look in the book of Philippians, chapter 4, and verses 10 to 13, Paul is writing to the church in Philippi. And this is what he says. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you have no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learnt to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learnt the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. I realised when preparing this that in the past I've kind of missed the point. I've taken this passage as saying, right, look at the situation I'm in, and look that despite the fact it might be really difficult, God has blessed me in this way, or he's provided for me in that way. This in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but equally it can still lead to the discontent, because I still find myself comparing the blessings that I've been given to the blessings that I perceive that God has given to somebody else. Paul explains here that he's grateful for the letters and the gifts of the Philippians, but he went to great lengths to explain that he would have been content with or without this, because his contentment came from God alone, with or without those gifts. Whether as he is now in prison, whether he was living in freedom, he had a contentment that came from relying on God. He had a contentment knowing that actually he would only reach proper full contentment at heaven, that this was his ultimate goal. We look at Philippians chapter 1 verse 21, and here Paul says, for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. Contentment for Paul on earth was knowing that in Christ he would one day gain the ultimate prize. However, even for Paul this didn't come easily. I often think of Paul as some sort of superhuman, some sort of super Christian. But if we note here, Paul doesn't say, I know the secret. He says, I've learnt the secret. He hadn't always been content. It was something he'd had to learn. And if we look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks about his struggles with this. Paul says, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we've experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. Paul had been to the point of absolute despair and come out the other side. Paul had learned to rely 100% on God. True contentment comes as we rely more and more on God. In the world, maturity is often measured by becoming more independent and more self-sufficient. As Christians, the opposite is true. As we mature, we become less independent, less self-sufficient, and more Christ-sufficient. And with Christ's sufficiency comes contentment. The more Christ-sufficient we become, the more we can rest in absolute certainty that God is in control, and the measures of the world become less and less significant as our eyes are focused on God and on the ultimate prize of heaven. How do we do this? Well, that's a sermon in and of itself, and in many ways something that I haven't got time to touch on now. But what I do know is that it takes perseverance, commitment, and consistency. As a runner, albeit not a very fast one, I can't expect to run a marathon off no training. And through lockdown, I've watched a lot of people take on the couch to 5k, where at the beginning, you might not even be able to run for a minute. But over the 10-week period, you gradually build that up until for many people, they can't believe that they've managed to run 5 kilometres. And I think this is a good analogy to developing maturity in Christ. We need to spend time reading the Bible. We need to spend time praying. We need to spend time just resting in God's presence. And maybe at the beginning, this feels like hard work, but the more we do it, the more consistent we are with it, the more we come to realise how it's changing and shaping both our hearts and our minds. And as we do this, just that relationship with God, that total Christ sufficiency, that ability to be content, the loss of anxiety, we'll be able to look back on those initial days and say, actually, yes, this is the point that God has taken me from, and this is the point that God has taken me to. And we'll be able to reap the rewards and the benefits as we progress on that journey to being 100% Christ sufficient and living in the contentment that Paul lived, knowing that I can do all things through him who gives me strength.